And you say, well, I just can't go along with that because, and you point out why from the Bible. They say, well, I don't get too worried about that because, you can prove anything with the Bible. Or I don't get too worried about that. Or I've had people tell me when I try to talk to them about maybe getting interested in spiritual things and getting involved with, a Bible study and hopefully coming to the knowledge of the truth and obeying the gospel. I say, well, I believe in God, but I'm not into all that religion stuff because, people use the Bible, and in the Middle Ages they fought wars trying to, they said they were doing it in the name of the Lord. Well, that doesn't make it right. They certainly did. People say, well, and on top of that, the Bible is just written by men. And so sometimes you even have people who claim to be believers that they say, yeah, well, I know I've told you before about a guy, I don't know him personally, but he's on an email list that I'm on. And he said before, look, you can't take the creation account literally. This is what he says. You can't take that literally because, Genesis is law. It's law for Israel. It's part of the Torah. And so it's not meant to be a historical account, folks. He's just trying to give us, and that's kind of what he says. Did God mean what he said when he said he did it in 6 days or not? So when I'm giving law to somebody, I use falsified information. It gets to the point of being ridiculous. But my point of this is that infidels use it. They undermine the faith of so many, and they say, look, even if somebody may not be the most militant agnostic or atheist or skeptic, if they can undermine faith in the Bible, then they've got you. Because you can look at nature, and we've talked about this before, and you see there is a God. It's hard to look at nature honestly. I would submit to you it's very nigh impossible, if not altogether impossible, to look at nature honestly and say, this all just happened without any kind of creator. But then you get into, well, why are people here on this earth? We know people die. What happens after you die? We know people do things that are wrong, sometimes very wrong and atrocious things. Can we make that right? Is there some kind of punishment beyond this life for that? These are questions, can we escape that punishment since we all make mistakes in our lives? These are questions that you can't answer through nature. You've got to have some kind of supernatural revelation. And that's where the Bible comes in. But if you undermine the Bible, there's nothing left. And it's every man does what's right in his own eyes, essentially. So sometimes this is not an accident, this undermining of the faith, of people's faith in the Bible. Sometimes it's just ignorance and people don't understand. And so that's one reason why we want to look at this. It's clear that the Bible claims inerrancy. 2 Timothy 3, 16 and 17, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. You've heard before, literally translated, the word in the Greek is theopneustos. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God. All Scripture is theopneustos, and in other words, literally translated, God-breathed. It's the Word of God, so we use that expression. 2 Peter 1, 20 and 21, the idea there of the prophecy came not in old time by the will of man. And we talked about this a lot in our How We Got the Bible study. Isaiah doesn't just sit down and say, yeah, I think I'll write a book. But holy men of God spake as they were moved, borne along by the Spirit. So the Spirit oversaw the writing to make sure the very words used were what God wanted. Make no mistake, those are two out of several passages, but for time's sake, we're just going to mention those. The Bible claims inspiration. So this garbage of, well, Genesis is law, so we can't really look to that for an historical account of creation, that's not going to get it. Because the Bible claims it is inerrant. And what a claim to make. Can you imagine if you or I were to sit down and write a book and we're going to say, within that pages of that book, I am the undersigned here, Chad Dollahite, writing this book, and I am attesting that it is free from any kind of error whatsoever. Man, people that don't like me very much would just be rubbing their hands. I can't wait to get hold of that. I'm going to show how wrong he is. And they would, because we make mistakes. I was reading not terribly long ago a preacher in his workbook by Brother Tom Holland. And when you open it up, one of the very first pages, it says, big, all caps, perfectionists don't write books. And there's a certain truth to that because we make mistakes. And it may be a typo, maybe just miss a statistic. Sometimes you may put a number and leave a zero off or add a zero. I saw it in a bulletin not too long ago where I think they had something like 36 in the assembly for one Sunday morning, and it got reported in the bulletin as 360. Hey, man, that was a banner crowd that Sunday, you know. Well, it was just a misprint. It just added a zero by mistake. So none of us would write a book and claim this book is free from error, let alone about 40 of us get together and write a book. Hey, even if I was dumb enough to think that I could write a book that was inerrant, I sure wouldn't think that 39 other people with me are also inerrant and are going to write a book to go with books to go within the big volume that are going to be free from error. And then for all of us to put our stamp on it and say, here you go, world. Here's a book that is free from error. Put it to the test. Yeah, and then imagine that. Not only 40 people, spread it out over 1,500 years or so, and still say to the world, here you go, it's perfect. Go ahead and scrutinize it. And yet that's what God's done in the Bible. And it has stood the test of time over and over and over. If the Bible is from God, it must be inerrant. So let's look at some basic principles. And some of these scriptures we'll go and read. Some of these I'll kind of give you a synopsis because I want to get through all these principles within the time frame that we have. And if we do come back and study this later, we'll break these down a little bit more in depth, although maybe not necessarily these if we feel like we've covered them well enough. But we'll look at some more. You'll at least get the idea for kind of how that study would go. Number one, innocent until proven guilty. We do this in the courtroom. I mean, can you imagine if you went in and you were accused of something and you really were innocent, but the court system treated you from start to finish like you were guilty? We wouldn't appreciate that. I mean, that's not even going to fly in life. You think about just regular old life situations. Parents may tell their children, sweetie, don't drink Drano, it'll kill you. Well, you know, my parents are probably lying about that, so let's go get a swig of Drano and see. We don't do that. We assume in normal situations. Now, granted, there are some people, and I've known them, and you've probably known a few, that I don't know why, but they seem to operate in life assuming the negative and guiltiness for everybody. Everybody's got an ulterior motive. Why did he do that? Why did she say that? But generally speaking, in life, we understand you apply this principle, innocent until proven guilty. So don't assume there's a contradiction until doing the research and finding out. Here's what happens. Atheists, skeptics, unbelievers, or whatever you want to call them, they'll come at the Bible not wanting to believe. And I read, it was in a marriage book by Don and Jane McWhorter. And they asked the question, and it was somewhere within the pages of that book, and it just has stuck with me all these years. They said, do you know what the difference is between a hummingbird that sips on the sweet nectar of flowers and a buzzard that eats dead carcasses? You know what the difference is? They both find exactly what they're looking for. They do. They find exactly what they're looking for. So the skeptic, when he comes to the Bible and he wants to find error, contradictions, discrepancies, he finds it. Not because they're there, but because he's twisting and manipulating and wants it to be there. Now, we got to be careful as well as believers that we come at the Bible and not just brush things off and say, well, you know, I don't have to explain that. I don't need to explain that. Well, we need to study these things, and that's beneficial. Truth never has anything to fear. And so we need to study. That's a beneficial thing for all of us. But don't just assume off the bat there's a contradiction there. Say, okay. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I've come across passages before. I've picked up the phone in the middle of a study, called a preacher friend, say, hey, you ever looked at these two verses? That appears to be a contradiction. Let's talk about that. Have you ever run across that? And he may say, you know, yeah, I have run across that, and here's what I found out. Or he may say, you know, I've never run across that either. Let's do some further studying. But I don't come to those two verses and say, you know what? I'm getting rid of this book, toss it out the window. It's got contradictions throughout. You see, that's what a skeptic does. And that's one reason why they're dubbed skeptics. They come to something and they just assume the worst and say, well, you know, there you go. Bible's full of contradictions. Can't trust it. And they just toss it out the window. Don't assume guilty until it's proven to be such. Well, okay. Can you imagine if we approached all historical works with the assumption that they are just filled with errors, contradictions, discrepancies. We scrutinize historical works, and rightfully so. But when you're studying history, whether it be Tacitus' History of Rome or, what's the other guy? I don't know how to pronounce his name, Suetonius. All these other historians, we assume it's right, but we do scrutinize it. But Pete, you don't ever hear people in modern day times saying, you can't trust that Tacitus. He's filled with contradictions. Even the skeptics and unbelievers will say, well, he's written excellent history of Rome. So, you got to, this is the first and foremost principle. Don't assume guilt. Innocent until proven guilty. All right, let's go to number 2. Possibilities are sufficient. Possibilities are sufficient. For example, one day, I'm at work, I go to the petty cash drawer, and I grab a $20 bill out of there. And man, there's Robert. And Robert sees me. And he says, I got him now, that Chad. He's stealing money from petty cash. I knew it. Well, number 1, he's assumed guilt without proving it, right? But there are several possibilities there. Suppose the boss said, hey, Chad, when you come into work this morning, go to petty cash, grab $20, go to Krispy Kreme and get donuts for the whole office. Is that a possibility? Well, sure. Maybe the day before, I had purchased something out of my pocket, and the boss said, hey, when you get in tomorrow, first thing, just go to petty cash, grab a $20 bill, and you can reimburse yourself for that purchase. Is that a possibility? Sure. Possibilities will suffice. Now, can you imagine 50 years later, if somebody sees that video, maybe there was some kind of inter-office camera, and man, they say, look, we've got footage. Chad's gone down in history as a good man, but we have footage of him stealing $20 from petty cash at his job place 50 years ago. And here we thought he was a good man. Maybe I'm dead and gone by then. They say, I guess we were wrong. That Chad is a rascal. Well, then somebody comes along and says, well, hey, hang on now. Maybe we should do some more research. What if the boss told Chad to go get that money and use it to purchase something for the office? Or what if he was reimbursing Chad for something? Or what if he told Chad to go get it and then to go make a purchase for the company? I don't want to hear about that. You just throwing out all these possibilities. It's clear there's a contradiction here. Chad is a thief. Well, that wouldn't be fair, would it? But a lot of times when we show that you look at, and we'll see this in just a moment. Here's a possible solution, there's a possible solution. They say, you can't even nail it down. You can't say if it's this or that. Contradiction. Well, no. If there's a possibility that it's either one, you haven't proven a contradiction. So, you got to understand what constitutes a contradiction. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment as well. Ask the question, is it possible that both accounts, or sometimes you're talking about 2 or 3, 4, but generally it's between one verse and another or one account and another. Is it possible that both accounts are true? That's what I've got to ask myself. Matthew 27:44, Mark 15:32. Matthew and Mark say the thieves, plural, reviled Jesus, right? What does Luke say? What does Luke record? In fact, so many people, unfortunately, in the denominational world, misunderstand this and try to make it a case of salvation today. Because they talk about who? The thief on the cross. Because in Luke 23, he says, somebody get verse 39. I think it's actually 40 or 41, so, where he actually changes his mind. But people say there's a contradiction here because Matthew and Mark say the thieves both reviled him. Luke says one thief reviled him and one asked for forgiveness. Who's got it?
One of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, if you are the Christ, save yourself and us.
All right. So hold your place there, Brother Chris, please. So the skeptic says, which is it? Was it both of them, or was it just one? I mean, these guys, they can't even get their own story together, right? So they say contradiction. Well, here's our question. Is it possible that both accounts are true? Is it possible? Well, somebody might say, I don't know. Well, how about this? What if they both reviled him, but then one of them realized he was wrong? Go ahead and read on, Brother Chris.
But the other, answering, rebuked him, saying, do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation?
And then he goes on and he says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And that's when Jesus tells him, verily, verily, I say to thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. All right, so they're hanging on the cross, these thieves that are there for, well, they're there because they're thieves. They're criminals. Jesus, of course, innocent, but they're there because they're criminals and they're being punished for their crimes. You're supposed to be the Son of God. You're not even saving yourself, let alone us too. Come on, man. I thought you were supposed to be the Christ, the Messiah, the Savior of the world. Maybe you hang there a little longer, you suffer a little more. I mean, who among us hasn't known somebody, maybe even our own selves, that in times of intense suffering, we do a lot of self-examination and start thinking, you know what, maybe I need to make some changes. Maybe I need to do differently. Maybe that fellow's sitting there and he begins to realize he obviously had some kind of teaching. You know, I've heard people say, especially this idea of I want to be saved like the thief on the cross. This guy wasn't just an alien, no knowledge whatsoever. He knew about the kingdom. You know, he didn't have a Bible study with Jesus on the cross, but he knew about the kingdom somehow. So very possible that he had studied under John, he'd followed John, heard him teach, maybe he'd heard Christ teach. Whatever the case, he changed his mind. And I believe that's the strongest likelihood, or strongest likely explanation is what I'm trying to say, of this alleged discrepancy. I think he probably reviled Jesus and realized, you know what, as he said to the other criminal, we're here getting what we deserve. But this man, Jesus, has done nothing wrong. And he sits here, he doesn't utter a word, he's not cursing these people that are killing him even though he's innocent. He's not calling down angels from heaven to destroy the world and set him free. He's, as Isaiah 53 says, like a lamb led to the slaughter. And it moved this man. And he repented. And he says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. There's no contradiction there. It also may be that Mark and Matthew were using synecdoche. In Genesis 8, verse 4, it says that the ark landed where? Answer carefully. Where did it land? The mountains of Ararat. Now, what's the likelihood? Now, that the ark was a big thing. But what's the likelihood that it landed on multiple mountains? Very likely, almost certainly, it landed on a mountain. But it's synecdoche. You're using many to represent one. Genesis 21:7. Sarah talks about who would have thought that Sarah would have nursed children. How many children did Sarah nurse? One, Isaac. Yeah, I may come up to a man and I may say, how many children do you have? I could ask Brother Chris, how many children do you have? He'd say, I have one, Jacob. I'm not going to say, hold on now. Don't try to contradict, Brother Chris. You have a child. We understand what that means. It's synecdoche. We use it all the time. We talked about that in our class on hermeneutics. It may be that Matthew and Mark just classified, hey, the thieves reviled him as well. And the synecdoche would go right with the one fellow changing his mind. Either explanation, though, is possible. If a possible explanation exists, there's no contradiction. Possibilities are sufficient. We've got to remember that. And again, go back to the example with the money coming out of the petty cash. Any of those possibilities are sufficient. It's not a contradiction. It could be any of those. So we got to understand that. Number 3, context is crucial. Well, Brother Philip here is a firefighter, so what if him and Miss Amanda are at a game and maybe they're watching Mr. Preston play some basketball or something, and Amanda says, Philip, our son's on fire, as he sinks another 3-point shot. Man, he says, he runs out on the court, he's got his fire extinguisher, and he says, I'm the man for this job. And he's going to put him out, right? Oh, we understand that. But what if they're at home and they're barbecuing? And here comes Sister Amanda in the house, and she says, Philip, our son's on fire. Well, then what's he going to do? Well, he knows that's a different context. Now he's concerned, and he's going to take action. Well, context. We get that. in everyday life. And then we sometimes throw it out the window when we come to Bible study. Context can make all the difference. Matthew 24:34, Jesus says, "This generation shall not pass away till all these things be fulfilled." Eric Lyons, and I forgot to mention, a lot of this, pretty much most of the big picture of this information is coming from an article on Apologetics Press recently. In fact, they posted part 2 last week, I believe, and I saw it and I thought, wow, that is perfect. I'm going to use that for my Bible class because that was exactly kind of what I was looking to do. And so a lot of this is coming from his article. Eric Lyons, excellent article. It's a 2-part article on Apologetics Press. But he quotes a skeptic who says, Matthew 24:34 is what did it for me. I couldn't believe the Bible anymore after that. I mean, here's Jesus saying, this generation is not going to pass till the end of the world comes. And yet here we all are 2,000 years later. Well, what's the context there? It's not respecting the context to say that. Jesus is not talking at all about the end of the world there. If you look at the context, back it up to the first few verses of the chapter, they show him the temple and they're talking about how beautiful the temple is, and Jesus says, do you see these things? There's not going to be one stone left on top of another that shall not be destroyed. And he goes on and proceeds to tell them. To this day, people still mistake a lot of times the first part of Matthew chapter 24 with the end of the world. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He says, here's a warning sign, here's a warning sign, here's a warning sign. Here's how you're going to know it's coming and it's at hand. Then he stops at verse 34 after he says, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled as far as pertaining to the destruction of Jerusalem. Then he shifts gears. You got the transition verse 35, and he says, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. Then he says, verse 36, but of that day and hour knoweth no man. And so then he proceeds to tell how there are going to be no signs of the end of the world. It's going to be like in the days of Noah, eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark. No signs. But destruction of Jerusalem, a lot of signs. And it's going to happen before that generation passed away. That's all just a matter of context, folks. He's not talking about the end of the world at all. And sometimes when we go to a passage and we go, there's a contradiction. If we would bother to get in the book and study it, assume innocent until proven guilty, study the context, then we'd realize it just vanishes. We don't want to be guilty of 2 Peter 3:16. Peter talks about those who twist the Scriptures to their own destruction. Hey, even if we believe in the inerrancy of the Scriptures, we don't want to be guilty of 2 Peter 3:16. So many folks in the religious world, they take a passage and they twist it and they change it to mean exactly what they want. I've got to go to a passage. I've got to look at it objectively, honestly, and study it and say, what does this mean and what application does it have for me today? I cannot just say, well, this is what I was taught all my life. And I understand. I know that's difficult. You know, ask anybody who's come out of denominationalism after having been in it all their lives, and they'll tell you it's not easy. But is it possible? Absolutely. If we honestly come to the Scriptures and study it. And that's what we've got to do. Number 4, the law of contradiction. Here's what Aristotle said about that. He said that the same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject and in the same respect. Well, another way of saying that is you can't say that something is and is not for the same person, place, or thing at the same time and in the same sense or respect. What on earth does all that mean? Here's a perfect example. Very easy to understand. John Smith is rich. And then I turn around and say, maybe just a few pages later in the same volume, John Smith is poor. Well, let's ask this question. Are we talking about the same John Smith? Is it possible that in a world of 6 billion people there's more than one John Smith? You better believe it. Get out a phone book sometime. Even names that we would think are not that common. Dollahite. I found a bunch of Dollahites in Texas. I don't know who they are. But I reckon we got to be kinfolk somehow. It's not like that's a very common last name. And I believe, if I recall, I even found a Chad Dollahite in that group in Texas. They're big into racing, so I don't know what their problem is, but they may not be kinfolk of mine. I don't know. I never got into racing. But, you ask, is the same John Smith under consideration? There may be a John Smith in New York City, and man, he is a self-made millionaire, and he's doing great. There may be a John Smith in Heflin, Alabama that, bless his heart, He's just living off peas and cornbread, you know. So it could be different people. It's the same time frame under consideration. You might be talking about that John Smith in New York City, and man, he was doing great, and then, boy, the stock market crashed, and he lost it all. And now John Smith is poor. Well, different times. At one point he was rich. At one point he was poor. Or you might go the different way. At one point he was poor, and he worked himself. He worked hard. He made a name for himself. He started this company, and now he's doing great, and he's wealthy. Different times under consideration. And it may be a different sense. It may be you say that John Smith, maybe we're talking about John Smith in Heflin, Alabama, living off peas and cornbread, and boy, we say, you know, that's a rich man. And we're using the sense of he's rich in faith. He's a faithful, steadfast servant of God. But I say, but boy, that fella sure is poor. And there I'm speaking in the sense of money. But boy, he's rich in faith. See, different senses of the word. We do that all the time. I ran across something. I was searching for some. I was looking for the Preaching the Gospel website, which I think has gone away. They've merged with GBN, and that happened when I was still at GBN. But I thought they still had a website, and I was looking for it the other day, and I couldn't find it. But I found another James Watkins out there, and brother James Watkins, might want to talk to this fella. But anyway, he was talking about all the different James Watkins across the country. This blog writer that's not the James Watkins that we know. And he mentioned one, though, that he lived, born in early 1800s, I believe, but he was a slave. He was born in a slave family. So that's a perfect example. You could talk about some James Watkins and say, well, you know, James Watkins is free, James Watkins is a slave. Different James Watkins. But what if the James Watkins slave obeyed the gospel? Well, he's free in Christ, but he's a slave in the sense of physically on this earth. I also found out from reading about that James Watkins who was a slave that he escaped and later, through his wife and her father, was able to purchase his freedom. So James Watkins is free, James Watkins is a slave. Different time frame, both statements could still be true. So understand what really is a contradiction before you say this is a contradiction. We got to get it right. What exactly constitutes a contradiction? Number 5, this goes right with what we were just talking about, is the same thing being considered. Well, I'm going to have to speed up here a little bit, so I'm going to go over these. You'll get the sense of what I'm talking about. Acts 12:2 says James is killed by the sword, by Herod. He killed James with the sword. Then you come to Acts 15:13, and man, James is alive and well at that council that they had at Jerusalem. So here's a skeptic. He comes on and he says, great day. I mean, come on. This guy can't even get it right a few chapters later. He's got James alive and well after he said he was dead earlier. Well, you know, it's a simple solution when you understand Acts 12:2 is James the apostle, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee. And then when you come to Acts 15:13, that's Jesus' half-brother. There are actually 4 different James that are mentioned in the New Testament. So it's not the same person being considered. Genesis 6:13-22, Noah's Ark. I believe we talked about this one before. 1 Chronicles 15:14-15 says they're going to put staves in the corners of the ark that the priests may bear it upon their shoulders. Man, one skeptic came to this and he says, I'm done with this book. And this happened. And he said, you got to be kidding me. This book thinks I'm dumb enough to believe that you build this humongous ark that's going to hold every animal in the world, and then the priests are going to bear it on their shoulders with 4 little staves of wood overlaid with gold. Man, I'm done with this book. I'm not buying that. Well, Genesis 6 is Noah's Ark, and 1 Chronicles 15 is talking about the Ark of the Covenant. In fact, the dimensions are given for it in Exodus 25, and they're much smaller, obviously. So, not the same thing. Many times alleged Bible discrepancies are just accounts of a different person, place, or thing. Number 6 is the same time being considered. Again, this is kind of breaking down number 4 into 3 different parts. Genesis 1:31 versus Genesis 6:6. Genesis 1:31, God saw everything that He'd made, and behold, it was very good after He created man. Very good. But Genesis 6:6 says, man, God has decided it grieved Him that He created man, and He's going to bring a flood to destroy all of humanity. And of course, we know later saved Noah and his family. Well, the skeptic says, well, which is it? Is it good, or does God not like it? You know, it's different times under consideration. When God created the earth, It was good. It was perfect, sinless. But then man, through sinful choices, sinned to the point that God had to do something. He had to punish that sin. Matthew 27:5, Acts 1:18. Somebody says, well, did Judas hang himself or did he fall headlong and burst asunder? This is one of those that you better you have to, I guess, kind of tactfully describe this lest you make somebody sick. But it's different times under consideration. He would have hanged himself, remained there for some time, and then due to the decomposition process, I read in this article by Eric Lyons, he talked about several years ago, a sperm whale had been beached and died, and they were transporting it, I guess, to dispose of the carcass, and it had become filled with gas from the decomposition process, and it exploded. And how would you like to be near that when it happened? Wow. Those are not little critters. I mean, wow. I read that and I thought, good night. I'm glad it's not lunchtime. So that's probably what happened to Judas. Maybe the rope broke. Maybe through the decomposition process he fell, but the swelling and then the impact of hitting the ground would obviously have caused him to burst open. But it's different times under consideration, so that's not a contradiction either. It's the same sense used. Matthew 27:5-7, again, going back to Judas, Matthew 27 says the chief priest purchased a field with the money. Acts 1 says Judas purchased a field. I think I got that right. I may have it backwards. But it's a different sense. The chief priest purchased it, but it was with the money that Judas had given back. They had given him 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. He went and cast the pieces of silver down, and then they used that money to buy the field. So in that sense, Judas did purchase it. It's like a dad. He buys his son a car, but maybe he gives the son the money, and the son goes down to the dealership and buys the car, or anything else for that matter. The dad says, here's some money, you can go get whatever. Well, did the son buy it or did the dad buy it? Yes, they both did in a sense. So it depends on what sense you're using the word. Isaiah 9:6 calls Jesus the Prince of Peace. Luke 14:26, Jesus says, if you don't hate your father, mother, brother, sister, and so on, you can't be my disciple. Matthew 10:34, he says, think not that I'm come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. Skeptic says, man, which is it? Is it Prince of Peace or Director of Discord? Well, it's a different sense. Truth sometimes divides. Jesus came to bring peace on earth and to give us freedom from the consequences of sin, to offer us salvation so that we can be at peace with God and our fellow man. But you know what? There are certain people out there, they don't want to do what's right. They want to follow what's wrong. They're going to persist in sin and bad choices. And when that happens, we've got to divide. You have to. Because light can't have fellowship with darkness. That's Ephesians 5:11. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. So differences in sense of use, that does not equal a contradiction. So understand it may be a different sense. And then here's the final one. Addition is not equal to a contradiction. We've got to remember that. Additional information is not a contradiction. One article says a man escaped death in an accident last week. Maybe this was a big accident and everybody's writing about it. So in the same newspaper, you read later on another article, and in that article it says a man and his wife are survivors of last week's accident. And so a fellow puts a newspaper down and says, man, I am done with the Times Georgian. These fellows are filled with contradictions, and we understand that's not necessarily a contradiction. The first writer is not denying that the wife existed, that she was a survivor, or that the man even had a wife. He just focused on the man for whatever reason. There may be a reason for that. It may just be an arbitrary decision. But he's focusing on the man, whereas the second writer mentioned the husband and the wife. John 19:38-40 says, Joseph of Arimathea came and buried the body of Jesus with whom? Nicodemus. Whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke only record Joseph. And so they say there's a contradiction. They say Joseph. John says Joseph and Nicodemus. Well, John just supplements it by saying that Nicodemus is helping too. Now, here's where you'd have a problem. If Matthew, Mark, and Luke said Joseph only had taken the body of Jesus and buried it, then yeah, we would be talking a different story. That'd be a contradiction. But they didn't say it was just Joseph. They just mentioned him. John comes along and supplements it and says, well, Nicodemus was there as well. You know, there are other examples we could give of supplementary information. John 18:40 is one. Barabbas was a murderer according to Mark and Luke in his gospel account and also in Acts 3:14. Whereas John just says that he was a robber. Well, is it a contradiction? Was he a murderer or was he a robber? And so the skeptics say, well, which was it? Well, you know, again, is it possible that he was both? Remember, possibilities will suffice. It certainly is. I mean, how many people are in prison today, modern day times, that are both thieves and murderers? The prisons are filled with them. So John may have focused on the fact that he was a robber, and the other gospel writers focused on the fact that he was a murderer. But it's not a contradiction. They're supplementing one another's information. So you got to understand what actually makes a contradiction. So I'm going to get up here. Assume innocent until proven guilty. Possibilities are sufficient. The context is crucial. Respect the law of contradiction. Is the same thing being considered? Is the same time being considered? Is the same respect or sense being used? And addition is not equal to contradiction. As we close out this class and this study, go back to the question we started with. Can we trust the Bible? The answer is unquestionably yes. There is, I'm convinced, I don't deny there are passages that are harder to understand, that there are seeming discrepancies that we have to study and sometimes spend a lot of time to explain. But folks, you explain this book in any way without divine intervention, you cannot do it. There is no explanation for this book except that it came from God. And we can trust it. Thank y'all very much. I've enjoyed the study. Give me some feedback on 2 weeks from now if you want to go in the direction of the alleged discrepancies. Otherwise, we'll go with John, possibly something else, but I'm kind of leaning toward studying the gospel account of John right now. Thank you very much. We'll be dismissed before worship.